Kia ora koutou katoa, and long life to you all, my fellow freedom-loving brothers and sisters. Greetings to you from Soviet, Communist, Socialist, Fascist New Zealand. My name is Billy Te Kahika, aka Billy TK Jr. I am Indigenous Māori and I am a Christian civil liberties and freedoms activist. I am a former member of the New Zealand Army, the New Zealand Police, and a volunteer in the New Zealand Voluntary Fire Service, and also former New Zealand politician. I'm also a pastor, a family man, and also a former international blues guitarist, just to top it off. But essentially what I truly am is someone that believes in freedom, and I have a strong desire just to live in peace with my family. And I've known for some time that New Zealand, along with the rest of the world, would eventually fall into a plan for global tyranny. A plan that, if fully implemented, would lead humanity into a new dark age. In early 2020, during New Zealand's first COVID-19 lockdown, I became convinced that the response of the world's governments, including that of New Zealand's, to COVID-19 was contradictory to science, their science, and was based on flawed logic. This came about after a deep dive into the entire issue, and also looking at the involvement of key actors and players such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the UN, the WHO, the World Economic Forum, Big Pharma, and many other organisations as well. And I took a calm, logical, investigative approach to my research, and really I came to the conclusion that any critical evidence-led researcher could, and that this whole issue around COVID-19 had nothing to do with health, but everything about control, total control, and extreme mind manipulation. Now notice I didn't include a reference in this list to money or financial institutions, and the reason why I haven't is because I believe that money is of secondary importance to this entire issue. Money is just a tool that they use to implement and bring about this demonic global plan of hegemony. In March 2020, I started to broadcast on social media my research findings, and I added biblical prophecy into these findings, and the response that I had to that was just simply spectacular, unplanned, unexpected, and just totally life-changing. These broadcasts had seemed to have struck a chord amongst people, and New Zealanders just couldn't get enough of it, and I could sense a real relief from my fellow Kiwis that they had confirmation and assurance that what they were suspecting and what they were thinking, that someone else had stood up in a very public way and was saying the same things, and that they weren't alone, and that they weren't nutjob conspiracy theorists. And I also acknowledge that at this time, what was really surprising is that I gained an international following as well for the messaging that I was putting out there, that there was something very, very critically wrong with the entire COVID-19 narrative of not only the world's governments, but especially the New Zealand government. And I want to point out right now that our Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, is one of the tyrants of today. Ms. Ardern is a former international president of the International Union of Socialist Youth. She was that for an entire year. She is one of Uncle Klaus Schwab's favourite all-time people. Why? Because she's a WEF young global leader. She's good friends with people like Bill and Melinda Gates, Hillary Clinton, all these famous people that are infamous. And you know, this is a young woman that was very, very young when she first became a recognised communist. And out of nowhere, this young individual became Prime Minister of New Zealand, and very, very soon after committed New Zealand to full and utter implementation of Agenda 2030 of the United Nations. Now, she didn't speak to me about it. She didn't speak to anyone about this. She just rocked on up at a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation event in 2019 in New York. It's an event called Goalkeepers. If you want to have a look at it, go and look at it and try and not vomit along the way. But she stood there in front of the world's media and amongst all these academics and royal type people, and she committed New Zealand to full and utter implementation of Agenda 2030. Now, if you know anything about the UN Agenda 2030, you'll know that that's a major problem. So the response to what I was saying online kind of put me at the front of a massive new freedom and civil liberties movement. It was totally unexpected. I became the face and the representative of the voice of New Zealanders that suspected greatly that something really very bad was happening to our beautiful country. So reluctantly, I also found myself the leader of the fastest growing political party in history, a party called the New Zealand Public Party. Now, I don't like politicians. I don't trust them, and apart from one or two individuals that are exemplary, really, I really do not trust and like politicians. And to become one was not on my bucket list of things to do before I get too old. But I felt compelled to do it because I had to speak up about what I was seeing, about the discrepancies, about the conflicts of interest, the nepotism, and the ongoing destruction of human rights and democratic freedoms in New Zealand. I just had to speak up, and eventually that led to me becoming the leader of this new freedom and rights political movement, which was a great surprise to me. So what fueled my entry into New Zealand politics was my deep concern that the New Zealand government's COVID-19 Public Health Response Act, yeah, it's quite a mouthful, was going to bring in, by law, the most draconian set of laws that we've ever seen in our beautiful country. A group of laws that would mean the end of over 30,000 businesses due to lockdowns, mass suicide like you would not believe. We've had almost 6,000 young Kiwis aged over the age of 10 to 17. We've had almost 6,000 of these young people in emergency rooms across New Zealand over the last year or so because of their lockdown anxiety that they just don't know how to cope with, so they're self-harming, and unfortunately they're killing themselves and ending their lives. And also at the hands of this draconian piece of legislation, people were segregated, they were lonely, they were dying alone. People were forced into a hermit-type existence where they couldn't see their family members. And then, of course, you had the whole outcome of segregation caused by, people that were saying, yeah, we need to lock down, yeah, we need to wear masks and all these things. And of course, other people that were saying, no, we don't need to do any of that. And so that divided New Zealand society. And then you add the vaccinations that are not vaccinations into the mix, and suddenly you had New Zealand divided almost in two. You had the mask wearing, vaccinated, lockdown supporting and cheering part of New Zealand, and then you had all of those that said, no, we're not going along with this. And so we had a successful implementation of Marxist ideology of separating and dividing a society like New Zealand. And we're only a small country, and overnight we saw people divided by this lockdown strategy of the New Zealand government. And of course that is absolutely disturbing and distressing, isn't it? So during the 2020 New Zealand general elections, my online following was bigger than Jacinda Ardern's, our Prime Minister. It was bigger than any other politician in New Zealand during the election campaign. I was also voted the third preferred Prime Minister in a very, very serious Colmar-Brunton political poll. Now, that was the first time that a newbie political entrant in politics that had ever been ranked like this in a political poll. This was unprecedented. And since then, I've had approximately 10 million people engage in my messaging. Now, that's a big deal because New Zealand, we only have just under 5 million people here. So that should give you a little bit of an idea of the scale and momentum that I had built during 2020. But as my profile became larger, as we built momentum, that was when the government and mainstream media attacks began. So after the elections, and despite being one of the largest political parties, consistently winning online political polls, and having hundreds of thousands of supporters, we were told that we only gained 30,000 votes. Now, that was despite the fact that I had over 78,000 people in my personal support database, if you want to call it that, and members on my Facebook page. And however, on the week of the election itself, the attack on me just took a whole new dimension. The most severe slander campaign that I think any political person has ever gone through in New Zealand was aimed at me. Overnight, I became a woman beating, a wife beating, philandering, non-bill paying, violent con artist, and they pushed it, and they pushed the narrative like you wouldn't believe. And also, to go with this, we had this slander campaign start on, let's say, the Tuesday before the Saturday of the election, and on the Wednesday they closed my political page down. Let me say that again. On the Wednesday before the general election, on the Saturday, Facebook closed down my personal Facebook political page. Now, we have just had revealed through an Official Information Act in New Zealand that the New Zealand government has had a backdoor key to Facebook's takedown portal. So you can work out from there what actually happened. So after the 2020 elections and in early 2021, I resigned from politics to focus my attention on the actual fight for freedom, liberty and democracy in New Zealand, and also to focus my attention on launching my new ministry, House of the Lord Ministries. Now, what I'd done early 2021, I'd worked out from the announcements by the New Zealand government that they were receiving the Pfizer vaccine, so-called, at certain times of the year, and I had worked out that New Zealand would go into a level 4, the highest alert level that we have, a level 4 lockdown in New Zealand around the middle of August. And guess what happened? On August the 17th, they announced that New Zealand, because of one case of COVID-19, so-called, that they were going to lock New Zealand down in a level 4 lockdown. Now, I guess most of you would know about the massive harm that lockdowns cause. We don't need to revisit that. And so my assessment had proven correct, that the New Zealand government was going to time a lockdown with the arrival of these so-called vaccines and the rollout thereof. And so on August the 18th, 2021, I led a very small protest on the steps of our state television company against the lockdown harm and the loss of human rights and freedoms in New Zealand. Unfortunately, on the same day that this lockdown occurred, we had a young girl, beautiful young girl in our community, take her life because of the anxiety that these lockdowns were causing. To me, that sums it all up. And don't forget that that for most of the planet, up there, you had a 99.97% chance of surviving contact with this disease. So none of this made any sense. And so I protested against this, and I was arrested by the New Zealand police for this. So normally when people had been arrested for breaches of the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act, people would be sort of processed by the police and released after 2 or 3 hours. That's what normally happens. But I was arrested and I was put in our largest prison for 28 hours, and the New Zealand police opposed my bail and wanted to keep me in prison indefinitely. Now, I pled not guilty to the charge, and fortunately I had a judge that gave me bail, but with the strictest bail conditions you can imagine. I was under house arrest for 19 days. I wasn't allowed access to social media. I wasn't allowed to talk to certain people, and my freedom of movement was restricted. I wasn't allowed to go to certain places. What this showed New Zealand, what it showed the world, is that New Zealand had matured into a full-blown totalitarian regime. So I've spent several days in court, and I maintained my right to peaceful protest as guaranteed by the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, yet I was found guilty on the 15th of December for breaching the COVID-19 Public Health Response Act. So what this meant is that the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990, which was meant to guarantee me my rights as a New Zealand citizen, had been suppressed in favour of a government that was intent on punishing me for being a dissident voice. I don't have any previous convictions, but I will be sentenced on March the 30th, 2023. Do I know what the penalty is for these so-called crimes? Yes, I do. I face either several $1,000s worth of fines or up to 6 months imprisonment, both of which would be devastating to my family and I. It's been a hugely distressful process and a very costly one, costing tens of thousands of dollars to defend. But one thing that we can take away from this is that New Zealand has now matured into a fully blown totalitarian state. So if you're thinking that the New Zealand government has finished with me using these protest charges to get at me, then think again, because they haven't finished with me. Additional to these protest charges, the government has charged me with electoral fraud and dishonesty. And to say that these charges themselves are fraudulent is an understatement. So at around September 2022, I knew that I had to document this entire drama in New Zealand. I knew that justice needed to have her day in the form of an accounting record of everything that's been happening in New Zealand for the last few years. So I decided that the best way to do this would be to film a documentary. I wanted the documentary project to be put together as a way to provide a sense of justice to all the people that have been hurt by this government and its COVID-19 response and the globalist plans that they've been implementing through the COVID-19 issue. I wanted to give people a sense of justice that had their loved ones die alone, that they couldn't kiss and hug to say goodbye to. I wanted to give people a sense of justice who had lost their businesses for a disease that represents the same harm and level of harm that an annual seasonal flu represents. I wanted to give the families of suicide victims a sense of justice and accountability of the government. And I believe that the only way to do that was to put together a documentary that would absolutely expose the river of lies that New Zealand and the world has had to endure for almost 3 years now. So where are we today? Well, I'm very, very, very pleased and I'm very proud to announce to you that the truth is coming. The River of Lies, the New Zealand Scamdemic Investigative documentary, is going to be a very, very disciplined, calm, fact-checker resistant missile into the wall of error, deception and evil that we've lived through for the last, again, almost 3 years. I want this documentary to shed the light on the incredible harm that the governments of the world, and specifically the New Zealand government, have caused their people. So we are going to have a 2-episode documentary. Episode 1 will be about identifying 10 basic claims made by the New Zealand government about COVID-19, and we are going to acknowledge each of these claims We're going to forensically examine them, surgically pull these claims apart and debunk them using the most accurate science, expert testimony, and also witness testimony of those people that have been harmed by the COVID-19 public health response strategy, and also the so-called vaccination campaign that New Zealand has endured for the last almost 18 months. So episode 2 is going to be a lot darker, because we're going to look inside the organisations and actors and players that have been involved in this issue. And what we want to do is we want to look at how people are connected. We want to look at money flow, funding flow. We want to look at how and if mainstream media has been weaponized to propagate and propagandize misinformation, disinformation, and to carry out slander attacks at the bequest of the New Zealand government. And we're going to look at whether there are hostile ideologies and organisations that are involved in this behind the scenes, and we're going to expose it. Now, the intent of this documentary is not to force feed in a sensationalistic way data down the throats of people and make up their minds for them. The whole point of this documentary is to get people to calmly analyse and look at this information and data so that they can make up their own minds about whether this is all kosher and it's all good, and whether this makes sense or not. But what we're going to do is we're going to give them the other side of the coin. We're going to give them the other half of the story that our government and the world's governments have kept hidden from their own people throughout this pandemic, so-called. And so really, our catchphrase for this documentary is "the truth is coming," and the truth is coming. But what we want to do is that we want to help people see the truth for themselves in a very calm way. Lastly, my dear brothers and sisters, I'd like your support for our documentary. If you could visit www.riveroflies.co.nz, let me say that again, www.riveroflies.co.nz. If you could subscribe to our page, if you would like to donate to our work that we're doing with this, because we are doing this for love, and we are doing this really on the basis of an oily rag, or less than an oily rag. So if you feel that this is a project that you can support, we would appreciate and greatly value any support that you can offer us. But we'd love to keep in contact with you and form a relationship with you as well from wherever you're from. And so I want to wrap it up this way, my presentation today, to say that what's really important as we watch the narrative crumble around the world around COVID-19 is that we don't allow ourselves to grow complacent and think that it's going to go back to normal. As Klaus Schwab said, it's never going back to normal. But what we do need to do is that we need to be vigilant, we need to be calm, and we need to be disciplined in the way that we assess data about these issues, whether it be climate change, which is integrated into the COVID-19 drama, or any other topic that may affect us and our freedoms, and therefore our children. So I'd like to thank the organisers of Anarchapulco for giving me this opportunity to talk with you today. I'm travelling filming the River of Lies in New Zealand Scamdemic right now, and I've taken this time out of our schedule to make this presentation to you today. And I hope it encourages you. I hope it lets you know that you're not alone, and that from my experience you can find courage to endure yours. So lastly, my dear brothers and sisters, I want to encourage you to seek the Lord while you can. This is heading towards a culminative point. The Bible has convinced me that it has all the data in it that tells us exactly what's going on, why it's going on, and what is going to happen. And I would like to encourage all of you to find the truth for yourselves in the word of the Lord. Thank you again for having me. Do take care, and may you keep safe and well throughout 2023.